Hello everyone and welcome back. We are picking up with section 2 of the lecture on psychoanalysis. So when we had last looked at this model, we had kind of started to understand how the ego is under a tremendous amount of pressure, right? It's under pressure from the id being the animalistic side of the identity, and the superego, which is the moralistic, moralizing, idealistic, and self-chastising part of the personality. So when we can't meet the demands of the superego, we experience moral anxiety, meaning that I somehow failed by my own standards. When we can't meet the demands of the id, we experience neurotic anxiety. So neurotic anxiety might mean that you experience, intense desire to hurt someone or to act out your aggression to get it out of your system, but you can't just do that. You need to find ways to do this. So we're going to look at the different ways that people try to find an outlet for their unconscious energy. Okay, so let's take a look at page 14. We see the six of the different defense mechanisms. Okay, we have sublimation on the next page. We'll get to that in a minute. But we can look at a phenomena like regression, okay, in which an individual retreats to a more infantile psychosexual stage where some psychic energy remains fixated. So one example of this is that someone, for whatever reason, deals with conflict by crying, okay, and that the purpose of this is to change the dynamics of the social interaction, whereby the focus of the interaction or the conversation is not really what the person has done or said or what's being asked of someone, but the interaction starts to focus on the fact that the person is crying, they're inconsolable, and that this, for some reason, which we'll get into a little bit more with the psychosexual stages, is what's comfortable for the person. But we don't want to just look at this in individual, intrapsychic terms. Also, let's acknowledge that there is a socially pragmatic dimension to regression, meaning that if we cry, people might want to comfort us. It was that way when we were kids. It's that way now to some extent. Perhaps less so, but the individual still finds a way to make it work. Another example of regression might be throwing something, slamming doors, right? Where the focus of the interaction is shifted off of the existing social or intellectual or psychological content, and instead it starts to be about just destroying something, venting, getting it off your chest. This might scare someone, right? If someone else is around, other people might try to calm you down. This is an example of regression. Okay, let's also think of reaction formation, which is switching unacceptable impulses into their opposite. So if someone is insecure about, let's say, their masculinity, they don't feel tough, they end up, going to the gym every day, learning a martial art, learning boxing, learning MMA, which isn't to say these aren't wonderful things to do, but when we look at the origin, the intrapsychic origin of this reaction formation, this defense mechanism, we are noting that this is happening as a way of reassuring the individual or of regrounding the individual in a way that he or she feels more comfortable. Okay, one other example of this would be, if folks are familiar with the movie American Beauty, there was a next door neighbor character who was, I think, the father of the main female love interest. And this character ended up actually, either, we don't know if he was a gay man, but he ended up sort of making a pass at the Kevin Spacey character. And when the Spacey character sort of said, no, I'm not interested in this, he actually shot Kevin Spacey in the American Beauty movie. So we could look at reaction formation as an individual being uncomfortable with their sexual orientation and then going very, very far in order to appear as being, let's say, heterosexual, gender normative, a man's man. And this is also an example of reaction formation because we see this character sharply criticizing his son for showing, sensitivity or weakness. Okay. So reaction formation it's different than regression in the way that it needs to be the opposite, right? Whereas regression is something that is childish. Okay. Let's think also about projection. This is when you get rid of your threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So let's say part of a couple, okay, let's say it's the wife. Let's say the wife wants to cheat. She's thinking about cheating. And somehow she ends up accusing her husband of being interested in cheating. So why does this happen? It's a little bit of a mystery, of course, to the dynamic model. We might imagine that just these thoughts of cheating are so present in her head that she starts to just use that as her template for imagining what people are going to do. We might imagine that there's not enough insight or critical thinking for her to say, oh yeah, that must be just because I'm thinking of it. It doesn't mean that he wants to. Okay, this is normal enough to think about cheating after a certain period of time in a marriage, but I don't really want to be thinking of these things, and what needs do I have that need to be met? So then she can then approach the situation pragmatically if she has insight into her projection. So this is part of why in dynamic therapy, people need to talk stuff out. Okay, denial, right? We can think of denial as something we might see in addiction, right? Where an individual refuses to think about the fact that they maybe are drinking 6 drinks a night, okay? They don't want to think about what that means. They just sort of start to comfort themselves with, oh, I'm just doing it for this reason, or I'm just doing it for the time being, or everyone else does it, or I only drink when I'm with other people. All of these reasons that sort of prevent someone from thinking about it. We might compare denial to rationalization, where rationalization they're very similar, right? There's a ton of overlap between all these defense mechanisms. But we can think of rationalization as being kind of like denial, but the primary means of distraction or of repression is logic. So this is the type of person who's able to elaborate a very intricate set of reasons for why a anxiety-provoking reality is not reality. Okay, so sort of explaining away. Sublimation is thought of as being, maybe the most adaptive or the best defense mechanism. All of these defense mechanisms are normal, providing that we're able to maintain insight into it while we're doing it, or we don't overuse it. You're able to still be flexible and still live life with a sense of openness. Sublimation is when we direct unacceptable impulses into, redemptive activity, making good on it, socially positive, socially useful activity. So this is seen as music, poetry, the concept and the social formation of love, the social contract of marriage, right, being a way to take your sexual impulses and incorporate it into something that is socially acceptable. Okay, and of course the relationship between marriage and sex has changed quite a lot throughout the 20th century since Freud's time. That's something we could think about. Okay, because none of these concepts exist in a vacuum, and they're meaningful within their social context. Philosophy, art, sort of ecstatic religious experience, these are all activities that bear a trace of their origins and the erotic, violent, subconscious aspects of our identity. Or certainly, right, we might see some unacceptable aspects of the superego need to be sublimated into art, right? Let's say someone is sort of a neat freak, to put it very colloquially, or maybe they have some obsessive compulsive aspects to their personality, and they find a way to express that and normalize that by perhaps writing a play or doing stand-up comedy. And again, we're highlighting the fact that these defense mechanisms are normal, that we all do them, but they only become problematic when we become rigid, irrational, and blind to our own motivations. Another key aspect of the dynamic theory are the age-related stages of personality development. This is also known as the psychosexual stages of development. So take a look at page 17 for 2 diagrams of the erogenous zones on the human body. Okay, so once again, we're veering into some human sexuality or sexual health territory. Okay, so human beings naturally have erogenous zones. So the mouth, anus, genitals, and if you look at the pictures on page 17, the dark orange color represents the erogenous zones. Okay, it also includes, the back of the legs, the hands, etc. Okay. What we're going to look at in the psychosexual stages of development on page 18 is how the individual is socialized to view their erogenous zones. Okay, they're socialized to view their erogenous zones in ways that are socially acceptable. Okay, so as we look at things like breastfeeding, toilet training, etc., right? People are learning what the social context is for your erogenous zone. So thinking of 0 to 1, the oral phase, where the mouth is the primary focus of pleasurable and gratifying sensations, where the infant achieves this by feeding and exploring objects with their mouth. The infant is having stimulation to the part of the body, the oral area, that's an erogenous zone. And this gives nice feelings, right? Because it might be also connected to feeding, breastfeeding, holding tight, feeding with a bottle. This is also going to be a social context for the individual. And, what is the social context? This might mean, like, how long do you have to wait to be fed? What is feeding time like? Freud says that this is actually starting to form the personality in a very meaningful way. So if something goes wrong during this period, right? So let's say a child is, we might imagine in some sort of an orphanage, right, overseas where they're not receiving enough care, and they have to self-soothe. They might take to sucking their thumb, and they might carry this on in a so-called oral fixation, right? Meaning, lollipops, chewing a pen, chewing gum, smoking, what have you, and that this becomes sort of an ingrained soothing cycle, a soothing ritual. One of the aspects of the psychosexual stages of development is this theme of arrested development. Arrested development says that, when you don't have your needs met during a particular developmental stage, you kind of like get stuck there and you need to keep like pressing that button in order to get over it. It's kind of like we can't just get over this stuff in this model. One of the major themes of the dynamic model is that people are caught in emotional cycles, right? That it happened to me once. I sort of like use it as a framework for interpreting further social interactions. I may bring about a self-fulfilling prophecy, or I may sort of engage with challenging feelings as a way of dominating them. Okay, we can think back to Brentano and the notion of internalization for more insight. Okay, the anal phase, ages 1 to 3, is when the anus is the primary focus of pleasurable sensation. So of course this involves pooping, toilet training, all this stuff. And once again, there's a social context here. Someone could have a toilet training experience that is normalizing or positive or encouraging, or it may be shaming, it might be negative. So Freud says when the experience is negative or shaming somehow, the individual is going to develop what's called a anal retentive personality. This is a phrase that has passed into colloquial speech. We probably have heard of the idea of an anal retentive personality. So this is someone who sort of makes a big deal of the experience of like holding in. Okay, there's a sense of power and control that comes from holding in. As long as you're holding in, you don't have to engage in the social process, right? Because people do need to negotiate toilet training early in life, and although we don't have a lot of language to encode that experience, it still makes a mark on our memories. Okay, so as a contrast to the anal retentive personality, we have the anal expulsive personality. This is someone who makes a big deal of, we could say, fetishizes expulsion. Get it out, get it out. This is something that is satisfying and gives a sense of power. All right, so this all may seem very strange, right? And this is a prevailing sense that we're going to get with Freud, right? That of defamiliarization, of dislocation, of weirdness. And so I guess all I can recommend is feel free, right, to judge this as being weird, but then try to give some intellectual insight to explain that weirdness. That really is what is most important here, okay? Ages 3 to 6. So the phallic stage. This is probably the most complicated phase in Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Okay, so in the phallic stage, the infant has basically learned that there is this relationship between intentionality and pleasure, okay, or intentionality and release. And so intentionality being, you can do something with your body. We start to learn that we have control over certain aspects of our body. So similarly, in the phallic stage, the infant or the young kid may start to play with themselves sexually a little bit and feel some good feelings from this. I did once read a research study that said that 50 to 70% of parents actually did see their age 6 or under kid, their young kid, their toddler, engage in some sort of sexual playing with themselves. So this is to say this is something that animals, humans do because it feels interesting. But of course, where the parent comes in is providing the social context, saying, this is okay that you're doing this and that this feels well, but this needs to be done in private. This isn't something that can be done in front of other people. So we might imagine that as a particularly non-shaming way of saying this. But let's look at other dimensions of the phallic stage because it is important. So something that is being put together, okay, in this phase, right? On the one hand, the kid is able to maybe play with themselves. Maybe they don't do that. But they're noticing a few things. They're noticing that boys and girls, okay, right, as social concepts, boys and girls have different anatomies. Okay. Furthermore, they're starting to learn that different anatomies are associated with different gender labels. Okay. They may be aware that their parents have different gender labels. So the kid starts to connect some of these dots, right? And, we don't want to overdo it and say that the kid knows the parents are in a sexual relationship because kids don't really know what sex is. And even if young kids do maybe see their parents, engaged in some form of sex at some point, they don't really know what it is, right? It sort of is there in a very intuitive way. So, a comparison that I like to make rather than just look at sex, okay? Because it's very debatable, right? Could a kid even be aware of this? Think of your dog or your cat, okay? Most pets, I think I read that an Australian Shepherd has an intelligence level of like a 6 to 8-year-old kid or something like that, right? Or pigs actually have the intelligence level of about an 8-year-old or something. But most pets might have the intelligence of about like, let's say, a 2, 3, 4, or 5-year-old. So it's actually a good comparison, right? And we can get into the whole question of how is intelligence assessed within animals and how comparable is that to a human model. We don't really have time to examine that in detail, but suffice to say, a lot of people, do probably feel that their pets are aware somehow of social dynamics, and this is the key question, okay? Does your pet get jealous? Right? Does your pet get jealous when he or she sees you giving affection to another animal? Does your pet get jealous when you give your boyfriend or girlfriend a hug? Okay? This is just something that I wish I could, have more of a dialogue with you all about this point here, right? Because we usually hear some really interesting things in live discussions about, my dog does get jealous as soon as my boyfriend comes in. He is right there, right by my side. Okay, but let's connect the dots here a little bit, okay? So kids, right, even having a very basic level of awareness, have some sense of jealousy, okay? So they may actually feel jealous of mom and dad. All right, they may not know exactly what mom and dad do. They may just wonder. They may not wonder, but they're aware that mom and dad are gendered, that they're in a special relationship. They're aware that boys and girls, okay, have different parts. So what is coming together from all this? This is very vague, but we actually see the early development of gender identity within a kid during the phallic stage, okay? And when you have a gender identity, you start to learn or you start to get a sense of the fact that the genitals in humans are an important part of intimacy, that it's an important way to get the intimacy that you want. Okay, why is it called the phallic stage? Well, it's called the phallic stage, right? This is sort of a Greco-Latin way of talking about the penis. The phallus is the word for this. And this is to say that under a society, we could use the phrase patriarchal society, but the point is to say, right, that men have a certain degree of status, right, within modern, American society. beyond status, right? They also have a certain level of, you know, say so. Okay? So, this is to say that the penis seems to take a certain priority when it comes to sexual relationships, right? And we could really look at why this might be. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex makes the observation that it's not really just the organ of the penis that is desired, but it is the social power associated with the penis, the social power associated with masculinity. That's actually what is desired. Freud, and I think Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, actually had some interesting things to say about this too, where she contrasted the Electra complex to the Oedipus complex. So we do see the Oedipus complex play out in the phallic stage. The Oedipus complex is basically where the kid, kind of, let's say the boy, has some sort of desire to connect with his mom and has a biologically rooted fear that he's going to be castrated or destroyed somehow by his father for impinging on dad's territory. The Electra complex actually says something similar, okay, but just reverses the genders. This is not exactly touched on in the Blackboard posts, but when you're trying to answer the question on the roller coaster study, okay, and that is by Meston and Froelich, you may take a look at some of the psychosexual stages of development, okay. So the basically though, right, after kids get this sense of like kind of what is sex, a very, very early sense, right? Because they probably haven't had much sex ed. If they have had sex ed within the home, which, it's good to start sex ed conversations young and to start with, stuff about boundaries, good touch, bad touch, that type of stuff. Um, you know, Eventually kids get sort of a sense of what the deal is with sex, intimacy, gender, okay? But it's very, very rudimentary at this point, okay? Ages 7 to 11 is what we call the latency phase. This is where sexual impulses are repressed and become dormant as the child develops same-sex friendships with peers and focuses on school, sports, games, other activities, other avenues of identity. Okay, so a key aspect to Freudian theory is the idea of the fetish. So the fetish says, the fetish is when something gives us a charge, right? You could think about, someone having a fetish for, high heel shoes. If anyone has watched the show Mindhunter, towards the end of the first season, there's an interesting scene where the main character is in a sexual situation with his girlfriend and he sees her shoe, okay? And we can tell it arouses him, but it also makes him think of some other things that maybe are challenging to him. But, typically a fetish in Freudian theory is needed for sexual arousal, or if it's not needed, it gives a huge boost to sexual arousal. So, in modern day, we talk about like a furry. So a furry, right, is someone whose primary sexual fetish is dressing up in a costume, like a mascot, right, and finding a way to have sex, right, with people with costumes. Maybe they leave the masks or the headsets on or whatever, right? But this is a fetish, okay? This sort of gives you that extra level of immersion, okay, in an erotic encounter. Freud said that anything can become fetishized. Right? This is very strange to some of us. We might assume that, naturally, we're attracted to a particular body part. We're born this way. It is what it is. So, Freud actually didn't say this. Freud said that there is no natural sex object. So let's just think about that a little bit more, okay? And this might be a question that we'll be looking at as an essay for the final. So let's really think about this. What does it mean to say that there is no natural sex object? So Freud says that even though we are very driven by biology, to a large extent, sexuality is socially constructed. All right. So we may, fetishize a car, right? We may sort of get a special feeling from our car. We may fetishize some aspect of sports, right? The balls, the bats, who knows what, right? It's very easy to sort of just name names and suggest that there are these unconscious dynamics going on. However, okay, kids aren't going to be really aware of the fetish content of what is in the world. Right? We sort of shield kids from this stuff. So, Do kids have sexual sides during the latency phase? Yeah, they do, right? But it's not really formed as sex or as a desire for sex because there just isn't that information there, okay? And so we do know that especially in urban environments, right? It's not uncommon to see individuals have sex at age 10 or 11. So that's just as something we'd want to be able to think of when we look at the genital phase, right? Typically, this is the last phase, adolescence. We associate it with puberty, right? In certain urban scenarios, urban, housing areas or different, cultural milieus where, it just is on the table. Maybe there's not adult supervision, okay? There's so much we could go into regarding that, right? Especially looking at how puberty is brought about earlier in life, right? Closer to age 10 or 11 in urban environments, possibly due to environmental pollutants, okay? Actually another correlate to early puberty is having the presence of a father in the home, actually, right? And that in situations where maybe having a same-sex parent in the home, interestingly, so there may be sort of like a hormonal component to it, right? So as we approach puberty and we start to approach a time when sex is socially acceptable, this is what's called the genital phase, okay? So as the adolescent reaches physical sexual maturity, the genitals become the primary focus of pleasurable sensations. People are encouraged to satisfy this in a heterosexual relationship, normatively speaking, right? In many Western societies, such as our own, right, we do see more equality in this respect, in which the so-called genital phase or the coming into one's own of sexual maturity, individuals are given more social room to have relationships with individuals of their same sex, of their same gender, okay, or whatever presentation is so named. But Freud is interesting on this point here of the genital phase, right? Because he says that, he sort of is the conservative, grandparent or conservative uncle who says, listen, you do have a very complex sexual side to you, and you probably could fetishize all types of interesting things or people or types, and that's totally fine, but you just got to be aware that what society accepts is the heterosexual union, in which the fetish is expected to be the naked body, or specifically the naked body parts, maybe more specifically the genital region of the opposite sex, okay? But we do know that, someone wrote a letter to Freud saying, my son is gay. Do I need to worry about this? And Freud, reportedly says, there's absolutely nothing for you to worry about this here, right? There is actually some research that shows that, there really are not mental health risks associated with being a gay man or being a lesbian. But the mental health risks come into play when the individual is stigmatized and harassed for their sexual orientation. So, research does show that if we rule out social stigma, that actually, it is perfectly healthy, right, to be of a non-conforming gender or sexual identity. So Freud, he might have known this, okay? I think he probably did know this, but, and this is not to give him too much credit either, right? Because he is making a very conservative recommendation and saying, listen, just play it safe, have a heterosexual relationship, and the fetish is going to be the genital region of the opposite sex, okay? Keep it simple. He probably also did recognize what was known as the Boston marriage, right? Or the book The Bostonians by Henry James, in which two women of, generous means of a high social class are able to live together as, lovers or presumed lovers. And this is totally fine. So, this is actually worth noting. We can't really go into this too much, but of course it's easier to have a protected space for yourself and for your sexual or gender identity if you are someone of privilege. Okay, so, basically so much for Freud's gender identity development, the psychosexual development stages. Let's move on for now. So a key dynamic here, though, that exists throughout the life cycle is repression. And, repression says that we experience things that are negative or overwhelming, and we refuse to dwell on them. We're unable to reflect on them, and in this way we accumulate experiences that we don't know about and we can't account for. Okay, this may make you think of Brentano. This is sort of like a scenario where there are multiple inputs and maybe not enough outputs. So repression can be said to accumulate. So psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy is going to be needed to unlock these unconscious experiences and to bring them under the control of the ego. When our experience remains repressed, we can't speak about it. But once experience is no longer repressed, then we might be able to speak about it. Okay, so let's look at the next aspect of the dynamic theory, and this is the idea of the patient, sometimes known nowadays as the client. In traditional analysis, they were known as the analysand. Traditional psychoanalysis basically works to strengthen the ego. That's something that we could say about this. Okay. We can't just talk about our experience because we may not know about our experience. So this is where we need to have recourse to other modes of inquiry, like free association, Rorschach cards, dream analysis, analysis of transference and countertransference, or analysis of resistance. Okay, in free association, we may say whatever comes to mind, regardless of how embarrassing or inappropriate it might seem. And the therapist is going to make note of what slows us down, what makes us uncomfortable, or what we try to censor. This allows unconscious material to emerge. Okay, so we're working to gently uncover this unconscious content. All right, there's a video that I'm posting of Tim Gunn from Project Runway doing a free association task. Of course, this is a non-therapeutic context, so we want to keep that in mind. Okay, so similarly, we're going to look at another projective test. This is the Rorschach test. Free association is also thought as a projective test. This is on page 22. Please take a look at the Rorschach cards here, okay? So Rorschach cards, this was proprietary information for a while and was not made public. And the goal of this was that we need to keep these images as being free of cultural associations. That was the theoretical, rationale. And possibly there was also some, guild type thinking there too. But, it's all up there on Wikipedia now. You can go on Wikipedia, look at all the Rorschach cards. I highly recommend it. Basically, the patient is asked to freely describe what he or she sees in the inkblot designs, and then the analyst gets a sense of what this means. What does this say about how the patient constructs the world? All right, I will still note that the Rorschach test is still used today. But the projective dimension is only one of 13 dimensions, according to the Exner method, which is the predominant method for Rorschach test scoring. The other dimensions sort of look at how individuals process information, how they integrate information, how they articulate information. So this might say something sort of about information processing issues, social deficits, visual impairments of some sort, or possibly, certain gifts, certain visual acuities, or, abilities to articulate ambiguous stimuli that might be a real strength of someone. We can see this through Rorschach test. Of course, in traditional analysis, we're going to look for, libidinal themes, sexual themes, violent animalistic themes, themes of fixations, motifs from the superego, and this is going to help aid our conceptualization. This is why in traditional analysis, the analyst is often there taking notes, okay? Let's talk about resistance and analyzing resistance. So resistance, this is the way that our flow of ideas are blocked, okay? So this might mean when a certain topic starts to come up, I change the topic. Oh no, that's too real, that's too awkward, I don't want to go there. Other forms of resistance might be showing up late, it might be insulting the therapist, it might be using defense mechanisms like regression, because this blocks the course of the conversation. And this blocks the insight that will come from a conversation, right? We might imagine a client who's saying, my kid is starting to develop sexually, and I don't even really want to think about it. And let's say the therapist is like, okay, well, what do you think is going to happen when your kid does start dating? And the student is like, no, I refuse to think about this. This would be an example of resistance, okay? Similarly, we have transference and countertransference. So transference is basically a social dynamic where unconscious urges or feelings, dynamics, wishes, are expressed, and basically the client treats the therapist like someone from the client's life. They treat the therapist like a mother or a father. They start to feel a certain way about the therapist. And this is why the idea of the blank slate is so important to psychoanalysis. Because if the therapist really was letting the client know about himself or herself, then you couldn't really section off transference in the way that you need to. You need to be able to say, listen, tell me more about these feelings. Okay. Because I think this says more about you than about me. The analyst may not actually say that, but that's the underlying message. So you got to be careful about, showing too much as a therapist in analysis. Okay. So the converse to countertransference is what the therapist feels towards the client. All right, let's break this down a little bit, because this gets into the idea of the self as therapeutic object, or the self as mirror, or some of Brentano's phenomenological motifs of learning about the other by studying the way that the other impacts us. So we're going to sort of assume that if the therapist has, practiced good boundaried, psychoanalysis, then we haven't let on too much about our identity. And we can kind of assume that if the client is making me feel this way, then maybe the client makes other people in his or her life feel this way too. Okay? So this means that if I'm feeling frustrated with a client for a particular reason, and we would want to go into the particular reasons, we could say, well, maybe this is something that's going on in the broader life of the person. Okay? Of course, this means that the therapist needs to be able to separate their own feelings from countertransference, or needs to be able to look at their feelings in a productive way so that countertransference can be meaningfully studied, right? This is part of why it's essential to be in therapy yourself as part of your analytic training, okay? And to this day, we do still recommend that therapists engage in their own therapy. It just is harder to require that now because, right, you basically need to say, can we provide free therapy to our students? Sometimes that's hard to do. Okay, we also might look at dream analysis within this model. This says that our ideas, memories, and experience can't be fully embraced and processed by the ego, but in a dream, it sort of comes out. So let's again think about memory, right? And we can think of how sights, sounds, places, feelings, people, times, images, characters, right? All these things sort of form a mishmash, right? We know that. We've already learned about memory. And these things actually come up together in unity in the dream, is what Freud suspects, right? So let's say I have a dream that a building's falling on top of me, right? Even if that is some random imagery from who knows what, I have feelings about that, right? So I need to look at my feelings about a building falling on me, okay? So in order to do this, we need to try to separate the manifest content from the latent content. All right, what does that mean? That when someone is talking about a dream, I need to walk through it with them and say, okay, well, tell me about your dream, right? So it's okay, I'm at a train station. It's the train station that was, in my hometown as a kid. So I need to say, well, have you been back home in the past week? Did you look at photographs of this, whatever? I want to find out, is this coming from just the previous day, something more superficial, or possibly something that's more part of the fabric of someone's life, or is it coming from a more deep-seated association? So this is going to separate the manifest content, right, which is what we see, from the deeper, more dynamic, more emotionally laden substance, okay? So one way that we do this, right, is that we direct the patient to look for the day's residues in the dream, all right? Once we've got a sense of the manifest content, we're going to ask the patient about the emotional and personal significance of the dream imagery, okay? That's going to be the latent content. After decoding the dream imagery, we're going to ask the patient to describe the dream one more time, and this time sort of like, start from the beginning, but then just like, it's going to be different the second time through, right? Because the client already has some insight into the emotional significance of these symbols, and so therefore something else might come up the second time through. But let's talk about symbols and meaning within psychoanalysis, right? Freud said you can't have a dream dictionary, right? So dream dictionaries may be very fun for looking at the cultural associations of symbols, but Freud said we always need to look at what the symbols mean to the person, right? So let's say I have a dream I'm at the dentist. My analyst is going to say, how did you feel about being at the dentist? What happened at the dentist? How did you feel about this? Do you know any dentists? How do you feel about that person? So, the dictionary of dreams, or the code, the decoded dream is always personal. And I think this is actually something that's very nice, right? It means you always need to um, figure out what your client is feeling or thinking or associating on an individual basis, and not stereotype them. Don't take a cookie cutter image, okay? So, finally, let's think about the goal of psychoanalysis, okay? And this is to reduce internal conflicts by bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness. This allows the ego to use language and use the pragmatic reality principle to regulate urges. People obtain a more objective view of their unique psychological makeup, okay, by doing this stuff. This is going to involve talking, dream analysis, Rorschach testing, analyzing resistance and transference, sort of putting all of this unknown, unspoken stuff into a helpful therapeutic context, a supportive relationship that's devoted to the truth. Freud said that, there may be erotic transference that comes up in the therapeutic relationship, right? And this happens. Freud would probably say it happens inevitably. You need to be willing to go there and experience that spark of excitement or that spark of intimacy with the client, but never cross the line, right? Never be flirty, and certainly never have a romantic or sexual relationship. That would really be violating the terms of the relationship, of course. But eventually, right, this is going to strengthen the ego. We're able to draw more unconscious material up into the ego, and then this allows the ego to take a more bird's eye perspective, take a more pragmatic perspective on one's life, on one's relationships, on one's emotions. So Freud said that psychological healing occurs within the context of a supportive relationship that is dedicated to rationality.